Hello writers, filmmakers, and lovers of storytellers of any kind. Today we're going to take a deep dive look at the wonderful 1993 Academy Award winning The Fugitive.
Every gas station, residence, warehouse, farmhouse, hen house, outhouse, or doghouse in that area. Go get him.
I think it's one of the great action films of the 90s, and it still holds up super strong today, and part of that is because the writing team included a man named Jeb Stewart. One of Jeb's other writing credits includes Die Hard, which also, has a little bit of cred when it comes to the action genre. Now, if this is the first time you're coming across the ISA, the International Screenwriters Association, we do a lot of different things, but one thing that we definitely always try to do is provide inspiration and education for screenwriters and storytellers, no matter where they're at in their career. And one of the ways we do this, one of the many ways we do this, is that our Director of Education, Max Timm, does a monthly free webinar that covers all sorts of aspects of filmmaking. And as the Senior Content Manager, I end up producing just about all of those. And something that happens to me while those are going on is either I'm working on my own story, and then of course I'm thinking about how would I apply what Max is talking about into my film or to my screenplay, or if I'm not working on something, sometimes a movie just pops in my head as Max is talking, and then I just continue to do the same type of exercise with that classic great movie. And for me, it was the movie The Fugitive that popped into my mind when Max was doing a webinar on 12 things that you should brainstorm before writing your first page. Now, The Fugitive, in addition to being a great movie that was great back when it came out and still stands up today, it was the first time I was ever in a movie theater where when the closing credits began to come up, the audience erupted in ovation. I was there with my dad in Lake Zurich, Illinois, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. Look, we know we're not in Westwood. There's no chance that the filmmakers are in the audience with us, but it was such a great journey that you can't help but applaud the screen, even though the filmmakers aren't there to hear it. What made that movie so great? Well, let's take a look at Max's 12 things to brainstorm before writing your first page. And we're not going to be able to get into all 12, or this video would be way too long, but I do want to take a look at a number of those different things and see what the filmmakers may have been thinking about in their brainstorming phase that came out so strongly and so positively, so effectively in the final version of the film. And to honor the great Chicago reporter, John Drummond, Bulldog himself, who is featured throughout this movie and still alive today, I'm going to wear his signature hat, and we're going to channel him and dive into the world of Richard Kimball and The Fugitive. Now, one of the things I really loved about this webinar is these 12 bullet points. They aren't in a vacuum. They aren't standalone on their own, because when you start to develop one, you can feel how it has an effect on the other elements of it. And if you work on all 12 of these things, they enhance one another, and it becomes the bigger story. Then it becomes the story as we know it. Main character uniqueness and flaws. And interestingly, the first thing that we talk about here does not apply to The Fugitive. We always think of stories as a main character overcoming a personality flaw. That does not happen in this movie, and it's one of the few movies where that doesn't happen. Now, when you know about this element of writing, which is storytelling 101, it's very basic. We know about this early on, that your main character has some sort of a flaw. They also have a goal that they need to achieve, and they can't achieve that goal until they learn to become a better person and address that character flaw. When you learn that, when you see that, it's very fun to watch and see how different people, different films have attacked that. And it's so unique that we don't have that here with The Fugitive. Richard Kimball is a successful and respected doctor who comes home one night to find that his wife has been murdered. Despite claiming that there was a random intruder in the house, a one-armed man, the police are not able to track anybody down, and the only suspect left is Richard. Kimball is arrested and found guilty, and of course, that should be the end for him. I was racking my brain for so long to try to figure out what flaw Richard Kimball had that he overcomes. You could argue, perhaps, that he doesn't know when to stop being selfless. And that would be an interesting flaw, because he repeatedly puts himself in danger of being caught because he does these random acts. The moment that he helps an ambulance staff with a gurney that keeps him around a hospital longer than he should be when he needs to be on the run again, it gives people a longer opportunity to meet and interact with him and realize that they're talking to a wanted fugitive.
Tell the attending he's got a puncture in the epigastric area.
How the hell could he tell that by looking at his face?
Or at Cook County Hospital, when he changes the directives on a patient and ends up saving the kid's life. These are big risks that could get in the way of his own freedom. However, in the process of doing that, he over and over and over again shows the guy chasing him that, oh, this is actually a good person. He's not just on the run, not just out for himself. He's doing these good deeds, which seem very weird for somebody that's just fleeing. That he's actually not just fleeing. He's sticking around. He's doing other things, and in the process, ends up helping people a lot too. So it's not your typical wanted murderer on the run. So that begs the question, what if Richard Kimball did have a flaw? Could that have been a way for the storytellers to amplify the story even more? Even though it's already great as it is, could it have been even better if he did have some sort of a character flaw that he needed to overcome? The answer might be no, but it might be yes. It's something worth exploring, and it's something you absolutely, of course, have to think about when writing your own screenplays. I'm sorry, I'm just being handed something. Breaking news, hot off the press here, from Max Timm himself. He wants to chime in on what we're talking about here. And he says, it's tricky to explain the flaw. When we think of that word, we think of someone that has something wrong with them. That's not always the case. It can be a trait or personality type. Kimble is the type that will always be himself to a fault. So much so that he's trusted the wrong people and therefore unwittingly allowed them to take advantage of him. He's absolutely hell-bent on proving his innocence. You could argue that that's a flaw. He is unwavering and unwilling to let go. Does he learn a lesson in the end? Yes. He learns to stick to his guns and trust himself as much as he might trust other people. It's probably the first time he's ever had to be resourceful in this way, where he had to completely rely on himself and only himself in this way. Is all of this clear in the story? Not really. It's assumed. The concept of flaw isn't really for the audience. I love this piece here. It's for the writer to be able to develop the character and find the moments that will occur because of how we've developed the character. So a flaw doesn't always have to be a bad thing that needs to be corrected. A flaw is really just a one-word way of describing how someone is, who someone is, and help us writers brainstorm moments that show us who this person is. Ultimately, it's a development tool. There's a lot to unpack there. When Max says a flaw doesn't always have to be a bad thing that needs to be corrected. That is a little bit surprising because I think a lot of us think about something that can be, I think we all know that it doesn't have to be a bad thing. As I gave my example of what I thought Kimball's possible flaw was that he's too selfless. Obviously, that's not a bad thing in and of itself, but if you were to look at Aristotle and the idea of virtue ethics, that you don't just need a certain trait to be a good person, but you need to have that certain trait in the right amount, because you can overdo it, and then a positive trait could become a negative trait. And of course, it is always fun to consider ethics and to look into philosophy when you are developing characters. But yeah, just in general, that the flaw doesn't have to be a bad thing that has to be corrected. It's not really a flaw at all, as when Max mentions that it's really about just being a personality trait, one defining descriptor of who this person is. And again, does not have to necessarily be something corrected. And what I love perhaps most of what we just got from Max is that we need to remember that this is a development tool for us. It's not for the audience, because unless we were sitting down breaking down a script, we probably aren't thinking, oh, what's the flaw? What is this person going to try to overcome? You're just sitting back and enjoying the story. But as long as the writer is aware of this flaw, this most iconic personality trait, then they can write to that and make that character a more in-depth person. Okay, and now back to our regularly scheduled program. Story uniqueness. Problem the main character confronts and a goal he pursues. This one is just so clear as day. He confronts the fact that he has been jailed for something that he didn't do, and the goal he pursues is finding justice and clearing his name. But it actually ends up being more than that, more than he set out for. You could have a very simple concept where a man is framed for murder. Maybe there's a love triangle or something just very simple and surface level like that, and he's got to go out and clear his name and find the evidence that shows somebody else actually did this. But he ends up finding out, as he is doing his research and his own due diligence, that there's a big pharmaceutical conspiracy behind it. So what could have been a very simple story, the MacGuffin, if you will, ends up being much bigger and ends up revealing that some people that he considered friends are people that were working against him. So when thinking about your screenplay, that is something worth looking into. Can you up the ante not just by raising the stakes, but by making the problem more grand, more deep, more complicated? Is that the right thing? It might not be the right thing for you. Maybe it would get too convoluted, the plot would get too overwrought. I think the thing, even with The Fugitive, is that element doesn't matter all that much. It's the MacGuffin, just as Hitchcock liked to describe it. It's just the thing that kicked off all of the action, and we understand that there's a deeper, a bigger story, a bigger world of conspiracy working against Richard Kimball here. That even his closest allies might have something to hide. Secondary character and their effect on the main character. I went through those last topics kind of quickly because I couldn't wait to get to this point. What an incredible secondary character we have here, and one that, if it weren't for him, I don't think this movie would be remembered other than for that amazing train wreck sequence. And to be honest, we spend so much time with Mr. Sam...
Deputy Girard.
Oh, sorry. Deputy Sam Girard of the U.S. Marshal's office, that he almost feels like a main character. And again, it's one of those great things in screenwriting and in storytelling when you got your main character and you have your opponent. It's not good guy, bad guy. They're just two people with divergent goals. Richard Kimball wants freedom. Sam Girard wants to arrest Richard Kimball. However, when you really look at it, what they both want is justice. And so that's kind of an unusual thing. And again, flaws play into this as well, because usually your main character has a flaw that your opponent or your secondary character doesn't have. There's the question, is there really a main character and a secondary character in this movie? Are they both main characters? It's a very interesting topic and one for debate, but if you were to call Sam Girard the main character, what would his flaw be? Now, I think there's really not a big flaw except for possibly this moment right here.
I can't believe you did that.
You think I should have bargained with that guy?
Yeah. I do.
How bad's that ear?
It's terrible. I'm gonna have permanent hearing damage.
Let me see it. Can you hear what I'm saying now?
Yeah.
I don't bargain. You hear that?
Yeah.
Sam Girard doesn't bargain. He's going to get from point A to point B at all costs and with no diversions. But if there is some character development, it's that he becomes open to the idea that the justice system got it wrong, and maybe Kimble isn't a murderer. The fascinating thing is that in order to catch Kimble, he's got to think like Kimble, and that includes trying to investigate the original crime. People often point to that very famous line where he says, "I don't care," in regards to whether or not Kimble killed his wife, as evidence that, he went from not caring to actually caring. I don't think that's true at all. I think the point of it is that he has a job to do, and which is to seek justice. And in the beginning of the movie, justice equals arresting Kimble, and by the end of the movie, that is turned a little bit to still apprehending Kimble. That doesn't change. That is his job. That is still his directive he has to do. But now he is keeping his eye open for other possible criminals that are part of this case. And for people that think he went from not caring to caring, he actually addresses it directly at the end of the movie.
Thought you didn't care. I don't. Don't tell anybody, okay?
And of course, what is a secondary character supposed to do? Have an emotional impact on your main character. And that ties in so perfectly to this next element, the ticking clock. What happens if the main character doesn't hit their goal? Is there a time limit? In this story, you could argue that there's not an exact time limit on when Harrison Ford, Richard Kimball, needs to solve this case, except the time limit is the secondary character. It is Sam Girard, who is a guy that is that Energizer Bunny who is going to keep pursuing. He's so good at his job, he's getting closer over and over again to actually apprehending Richard Kimball. So therefore, he is the ticking clock. He is certainly going to eventually get to him. So Kimball knows that every moment matters. He has to get things done as quickly as possible because the police are hot on his tail. And when asking what happens if the main character doesn't hit their goal, as we know, there's a loss of freedom, but also his sentencing at the beginning of the movie.
Judgment of this court that you be remanded to Illinois State Penitentiary at Menard, where you will await execution by lethal injection.
This is back when Illinois still had a death penalty, so it's not just going to jail, it's being sentenced to death, and you cannot, on a personal level, have higher stakes than that. Setup event, inciting incident. This one's very straightforward. The setup event is literally a setup. His wife is murdered, and he ends up being framed for it. And of course, the inciting incident, the opportunity, is when there's a bus crash, becomes a train crash. He has the opportunity to flee, and he does so. And of course, that moment, which is such a cinema spectacle, that they actually crashed a train into a bus here. He could have just run. Kimball could have just run, but instead he took to the last minute to actually save the life of one of the guards on the bus. And by the way, shout out to Richard Reel here in a kind of forgotten about role that he played. Yes, he was the guy that not only was on this bus.
You see, it would be this mat that you would put on the floor and would have different conclusions written on it that you could jump to.
That is the worst idea I've ever heard in my life, Tom.
Yes, it's horrible.
But yeah, also the same guy that created the jump to conclusions mat. And the last brainstorming element that I'll talk about today, which is not the last thing that Max talks about in his 12-point webinar, is the second act recurring moment. And wow, what an opportunity this is within this movie. So we know that it's the fugitive. It's a guy that's going to be on the run, hiding from the police. We see that over and over again. And if that happened over and over again, that would be fine. That would meet audience expectation. It is the promise of the premise. It's a cat and mouse chase where one guy is running and the other guy is hunting him down and getting closer every time. And it's getting more intense each time that they almost interact with each other. But it's so much more than that, because Kimble is continuing to put himself into a more and more vulnerable position as he's getting closer to the answers he's seeking out. Now the US Marshals know that they need to be on this same wavelength as him, not just to try to solve the case also, but try to guess where Kimble is going to end up doing his investigations. And of course, we're seeing this with just huge set piece after set piece. This happens at the hospital he used to work. It happens at a prison where he goes to try to confront one of his possible suspects who has since been incarcerated. He goes to a place that's surrounded by police to see if this one-armed man is possibly the one-armed man that killed his wife. And then of course there's also the epic experience where he blends into the audience during Chicago's St. Patrick's Day parade, which is all stolen shots. Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones were really running around downtown Chicago without permits, shooting during this massive holiday parade. You just cannot beat that level of authenticity. So that is my look at the great 90s action film, The Fugitive. Again, still one of my favorites, especially as a guy growing up in Chicago. And shout out to a pre-Dateline Lester Holt, who has a cameo at the end of that. If you want to see more videos like this from the ISA, where we are doing deep dives, looking at great films, give us a like. That lets us know that you want to see more content like this. If not, that's fine too. Just comment what you would like to see from us. We exist to try to entertain and inform and inspire you. Also, do you disagree with anything I talked about in this video? I'd like to know that too. It's all about having a dialogue. And of course, to really dive into this entire premise, you have to check out Max's 12 Things to Brainstorm Before You Write a Page. And keep an eye out for future ISA webinars that Max Timm hosts. As I've mentioned, they are free for everyone, and he does them about once a month. So there's constantly new content coming out. Check out the ISA Pro Tips page. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've called out a couple of fun cameos that you see throughout this movie, but here's one last one to end off on. And it's not a cameo, it's a before they were stars. Because yes, the janitor from Scrubs makes an appearance in this movie.
I saw you in The Fugitive.
Oh, yeah. I was in a Harrison Ford movie, but you know what? I chose this life instead.
But really big shout out to Scrubs for having a lot of fun with this.
Kimble!
You tell anybody, I'll kill you.